Awesome. Hi, Nick. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I truly appreciate it as we talk about the legacy of the man that is and was Steve Johnson in the 80s.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. And your office and background definitely rivals mine.
One thing that I had to talk about regarding this is I love how in Rubberhead you really talk about the legacy of Jack Pierce and Dick Smith too. And I love how you've got this, like I always see it as the icons of horror. We talked about Vincent Price. These are the original OG guys that were the icons of horror films. And then you've got guys like Dick Smith, and then that beget Rick Baker, Jack Pierce beget Dick Smith, and so on. And Steve was the the one that inspired all these new guys and brought them to that. And I love that you kind of gave a history not just of Steve Johnson, but of special effects.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, we really wanted to do that. We did, but we wanted to really intentionally not do like a timeline sort of paint by numbers Wikipedia style
Yeah.
documentary about the history of effects makeup. So we wanted to include a mention of the history of all of these people, but make it contextual to the story where it would actually serve the story. But
Yeah.
you would naturally were able to see this progression of something that I feel is not happening as much nowadays, which is the idea of apprenticeship. So
Yeah.
there was Dick Smith, and then Rick Baker apprenticed under Dick Smith, and then Steve Johnson and Rob Bottin apprenticed under Rick Baker, and then it just birthed all of these artists. But the idea of apprenticeship we definitely wanted to get into, and also nod to the great master effects artists who came first. So I'm glad that landed for you.
Oh, it totally did. And it also showed I always talk about how horror fans and horror people are like the nicest ones, and we have like a family. Like
Oh yeah.
I always use the analogy of seeing a guy and like he's got a Halloween t-shirt on. There's Michael Myers, and we just meet eyes and we walk by
Yeah.
and you just you know it. You know who they
Uh-huh.
are. You already know. And I love that that kind of came across in this too, that what kind of industry does that where they help each other anymore? I mean, it really doesn't happen that often.
Yeah, it's funny. I've heard the same thing about metal fans, and I've experienced the same thing with metal fans,
Yeah.
where we, like horror fans and metal fans, are thought to be these sort of dark, brooding, gothy people. Nothing wrong with being a goth. I'm kind of a sleeper goth in a number of ways, but we're typically really, really nice people, and
Yeah.
we like to be around each other. And yeah, as I reach a certain age, I stopped wearing like loud band t-shirts and logo t-shirts and like horror t-shirts. And then I went out and I wore a Lost Boys t-shirt and I made a new friend that day. And I'm like, okay, you got to fly the flag, you
I
know?
mean, over on that side is my David mask.
Oh, nice.
And yeah, I'm a Lost Boys geek. That kind of was my gateway drug a lot too. I started with
Oh,
Universal
cool.
Monsters, but when I was 14 and Lost Boys came out, it was over. I was
So
like,
you got to come to New York and see the musical.
oh, dude, I talked to Patrick Wilson
Oh, wow.
and yeah, and I talked to him about Tobias. I shouldn't hog up interview time with this stuff. I will geek out about this and go on.
Yeah.
So one thing that I liked too was you focused on the what was so neat about practical effects, and especially at that time, was the figuring things out. And there was no blueprint. These
Right.
guys created it. They created the blueprint. And I was wondering if you could give some more insight into talking to Steve about that and how what you discovered as you went along with that part of it, what the just invention of everything.
Yeah, that was one of the more fascinating aspects for me was the problem solving aspect of it. And Rick Baker, there's a line in the movie, we have this piece of archival footage where he's talking about making effects and he says, we're inventors. Directors come to us with an effect idea. We have to invent a way to do it. This is pre-CGI. He was inventing these incredible mechanisms for American Werewolf in London, that transformation sequence. They were like five different inventions that he came up with. I mean, I've said this before, you to do this type of work, you basically had to be Leonardo. You had to be a sculptor and a painter and an inventor, and you had to understand how mechanisms worked. And you also had to understand biology. If you're making a werewolf, you need to know what wolf musculature looks like and how it moves under, their bodies. But as far as invention, that was a big theme of the movie because when Steve was young, he didn't know how to make practical effects. There was no YouTube, there was no master class, and he had to invent his own techniques for making effects. So that was instilled in him at a young age. He developed that on his own as this very ambitious young kid who was so driven, but he was living in like Texas, where he was nowhere near
Yeah, it was
places
nowhere
where
near
these
anything.
effects were being done. So he was a young, enterprising kid who was forcing himself to figure things out. And Rick Baker saw that in him. And because Rick Baker understood that effects artists are inventors. And I think that was one of the things that set Steve on the path was just Rick Baker observing, like, oh, you are forging new ways of doing these things. That's the job. It's not necessarily can you make the best werewolf or best monster, whatever. It is everything's going to go wrong on set. And there's so many complexities to doing this right. You have to be on your toes and you have to think like an inventor. So I'm really glad that you picked up on that because that was a big theme and one of the fascinating aspects of learning all of this is yeah they have to be they had to be inventors with what they were doing. The complexity of it is just extraordinary.
Well, and I'm about to lose you here, but one thing I wanted to also say thank you to talking about was, his history of craziness that he was and is sort of still. It, I'm very happy that you didn't pull away from that because that was part of that time
Oh yeah.
and it's important to hear about it. But the fact that he's still around sort of and and he he was still able to perform and do what he did, but he didn't lie about the fact that it was damaging, you
Yeah.
know. He owned up
Hmm.
to, and I like that part of it. But also I like the fact that, you talk about in there, like we were just saying, that they have to be biologists, they have to be it's insane. And did Steve ever go to school for this at all or have any kind of nothing? So how
Nothing.
brilliant do you have to be to figure this stuff out?
You have to be pretty brilliant and also driven. He was very passionate, very inspired. But I do think he's got an above average IQ. I think that that helps on top of everything else. But he was very, I think he was very driven. And that's why we really focused on childhood, not as like a waypoint, like, oh, here's where he grew up. And blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah. It was like, no, his childhood was fundamental to who he later became. And he was very passionate, very driven as a child and figuring things out through trial and error, which, speaks to the idea of invention that we were talking about before, but it helps to be smart too, and
Oh,
driven,
yeah.
and he's both, he is a genius.
I talked to the guys at Weta once and I asked them, how do you go into this with the biology aspect of, say, making a weapon for an alien?
Yeah,
And how deep do you go with it? And it's pretty amazing the stuff these guys do. So
yeah.
again, Nick, thank you so much again for making this for the legacy of Steve
Thank you,
Johnson. May he rest in peace.
thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys.